Welcome. We're going to start in just a moment. Our next speaker is Mr. Randy Brandt. He's best. He was the keynote speaker at KansasFest in 1995. He did an excellent presentation here, not a keynote, but good enough to be a keynote 5 years ago. But he's back with us again. He is best known for AppleWorks and Beagle Bros. He is the man behind Timeout. He is also responsible for Gem Software. Randy?
All right, we got a green screen like old school, and it's coming back. So the initial screen, Fireside Chat, was Andy Malloy's idea. We were trying to come up with a title, and Andy just said that. I changed, oh, there we go, changed things a little bit. But I contacted Mark Simonsen, who you should know owned Beagle Brothers for a while, and so he recorded a little message to you guys. So this is Mark with his two sons, Mark Russell and Brandon, and Mark is going to have a little bit to say if our audio is hooked up correctly here, so let's see what we get. No, and it's not wanting to play. It worked in testing. Does anyone know why it wouldn't? Let's try to see if it'll play on my computer without that.
Sure.
Guess we should stick with the Apple II here. So for some, I'm gonna see if I can just use my mic here to get Mark, since it's not working on that, but it is working here.
Good morning, KansasFest, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when Randy shares this with you.
Why are we not getting that?
Congratulations on keeping KansasFest going and the Apple II alive and well. Good job. I cannot believe it's been 7 years since I was there. I wish. Good morning, KansasFest, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when Randy shares this with you. Congratulations on keeping KansasFest going and the Apple II alive and well. Good job. I cannot believe it's been 7 years since I was there. I wish I could be there with you. I do occasionally see some of your online postings and activities. You might remember 7 years ago I told you I was hoping or maybe planning to retire soon and spend more time with my Apple IIs. Well, just when I was ready to do that in 2013, I was contacted by an international consulting firm that made me an offer I couldn't refuse. My current client is a Fortune 100 company, American Airlines, and to think it all started with coding the 6502. Hope you guys and gals have a great time this weekend. Randy is funny and smart and awesome, so pay attention. I'm with you in spirit. Apple II forever.
He charged me more than his American Airlines fee to put that little positive thing in there about me. But now Mark and I have stayed good friends. He's obviously, you know a lot of his story. If you missed out on when he spoke here, then go to the archives and listen to the audio of it. It's really good. He's had an interesting life, and he was a great guy to work with, and I enjoy staying in touch with him along with a bunch of the other Beagle guys. So as was mentioned by Peter, I only spoke once, but for some reason we have KansasFest 2012 and a history of AppleWorks. No idea why. There's two of them up there. I don't know if anyone knows. Both posted by KansasFest. But
probably my fault. I'm sorry.
This one must be better. It's got 1,373 views. That one's only got 45. So I did a better job on the second one, I guess. But anyway, I didn't want to just repeat the same thing, obviously, because you could just go on there and pick either one and even listen to both of them and get the same thing twice. So I was trying to think of some ways I could change it up a little bit. And we've got some ideas. I'm going to kind of go through some of the characters, just kind of free associating through some of the people that I've run into and been involved with over the years. And then if we get through in time, you know, we can have room for a little Q&A, or else just individually I'll be around till Sunday morning. So be happy to answer any questions you have about Beagle or Gem or Claris or any of that. But I thought I'd start off real quick with family. My wife, Joanna, which is the inspiration for Gem Software, Joanna Ellen Morrison. I was playing on 2+ at school, doing a lot of playing sabotage and things of that nature on the 2+, and she'd come into the library and want to know why I was always on the computer, and I said, I'm going to start a software company and name it after you. And I think her response was, then why are you playing video games all the time? But she was a teacher, as was I. We were both education majors, and so I thought, well, teachers need something, so I created Grade Aid, which was a basic with a few ampersand extensions, largely due to Call Apple's All About Applesoft. I learned a lot in there, and I sold that for $10 a pop through Gem Software, and so that's where it all began. And actually, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years later, I ran into a teacher that was still using it to do their grades, so I guess he got his $10 worth out of it. But this picture here is her a couple years ago, looking pretty young for a grandma, graduating with her master's degree. She had epilepsy and was suffering some bad reactions to medication, couldn't do much, couldn't work, and couldn't drive. So she'd get up and work for like about an hour online and then go collapse in bed for a couple hours and get up again, work online, and she managed to get through her master's and got her master's in curriculum development. So I was very proud of her for pulling that off despite being ill, and she's fully recovered. She's fully recovered, and she's back to substituting. That way we can travel around when we want, when my schedule's a little more flexible. So she substitute teaches still and has not had any recurrences after having 6 seizures in one day. So we're very thankful that that's been behind us for several years now. And I'll give you a quick update on my family. Now, the interesting thing here, 2 things actually. Erica is the second oldest on the far your left, and she wanted to get back to her roots, so she moved back to San Diego. And as I told some of you, she got a job. She works with Small Business Association, business loans, and she got a job less than 2 miles away from the Beagle office where I worked when she was born. So kind of definitely getting back to her roots. She likes to spend her time on the beach, lives half a block from the beach. So she's back in San Diego. Heather's the next one. She's the mother of our 2 grandkids. And she was the one mentioned if you used Ultra Macros or Super Macworks, any of those, the both Apple and I think it was, or Option and Command for Name, put Heather Brandt, had her name on there. So she'd come with me to user groups and pull names out of hats for drawings for raffles and stuff when she was about 3 years old. So that was a lot of fun. The next one, Amelia, obviously this is her wedding, and she's one of my twins with Matthew here. She's living in Alberta, Canada, and about to move up to a little town called Stettler, and she's going to be a pastor's wife there. Her husband got a job there at a church after graduating as valedictorian in school, so I guess she picked a smart guy. Michael is my oldest son, and he got his degree in computer science from University of Colorado and works there at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and just last week was at the Python conference. So I didn't get to play hockey with him for the last couple of weeks, but we play hockey together on an adult team, so that's a lot of fun. And then the youngest is Matthew. He's 27 minutes younger than Amelia, and he just graduated not too long ago, high honors from Colorado School of Mines in mechanical engineering. Does a little bit of programming as it relates to engineering, but his main focus is engineering. Now, the very interesting thing about Matthew, and this all ties into computer stuff, who remembers my shareware editor called Rose 16? I know if John is here. Yes, John Brooks. It was an editor that dropped in for APW, and I called it Rose 16 because it was 16-bit, and the Rose stood for like either Randy's own source editor or row-oriented screen editor or something. There was a couple of possibilities, but I called it Rose 16. Well, Matthew got engaged to Rose in 2016. So they actually just got married. She's now my daughter-in-law, and they don't always look like that, but yeah, she does smile at him occasionally. He always looks like that, but she smiles. So who knew? I created Rose 16, and we got a Rose added to the family in 2016. That was kind of bizarre. So what am I doing? Band of tours. I got cards if anyone wants a current business card. I lead World War II history tours, Band of Brothers inspired, hence the name. Go to France, Belgium, Normandy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany, and I've been doing that for a couple years, go every September, so that's a lot of fun and very interesting. And then we sometimes run into Frenchmen out there, but we'll talk about that later. But I also made a website where the past meets today, and I do some photography stuff. I thought this is kind of a cool one at Stonehenge. I shot into the sun, breaking the rules, but I wanted the stones to be real dark and kind of menacing with the nice cheery blue sky and green grass, so I think it turned out all right. So if you're interested in photography at all, that's where thepastmeetstoday.com. And they also do montages there, World War II history photos combined with modern ones. So here you see the tourist taking a selfie with the German army, so kind of an interesting effect there. I don't know who drove me out there, some Antoine guy or somebody drove me out there, but anyway, so that's kind of the background. And as I said, Andy Malloy said, you could call it Fireside Chat or something. Well, that seemed fitting because it turns out that we actually were in black and white back in those days, just like World War II and FDR. Although, yes, the original video is actually color, believe it or not. Yes, we had color back in the early 90s. But I guess Antoine's digitizer was black and white, or he also thought it was artsy or something. But that goes back to the early days. Well, I wanted a little bit different title than just Fireside Chat, and I tend to go a little bit crazy with photoshopping. That's more of a verb nowadays. I actually use Pixelmator. Anyone use Pixelmator on the Mac? Yes, great little program. Love using it. So I was inspired to create the official screen, Children of the Apple, based on a short story by Stephen Wozniak. So I don't know if Stephen King would approve, but in any case, maybe that's jobs there. I don't know. But if we're going to talk about the history of Apple, Apple Works and Beagle Brothers and all that, there's really only one person you can go back to for the very beginning, and obviously that is Mike Maginnis. You see Mike here with a couple of his fans, a guy named, I think, Randy and maybe Steve or something. This is at Apple Fest a few years ago, obviously when Woz was here. And Mike was kind enough to get a 2+ case signed for me. I'd met Woz before, but I didn't have any signed Apple II stuff. So Mike got the Apple II Plus cover, and then we swapped out mine for his, and now I've got a signed one. Actually, Randy signed it as well. But I said I'd be kind of free associating. Well, Randy's initials, obviously RW. A lot of us know another RW, yes, the infamous Roger Wagner, one of his cooler looking outfits there. Roger was actually in San Diego, very close to where I lived, closer than Beagle Brothers, and I loved Merlin Pro, and I saw a couple of typos in the manual, so I thought I'd go apply for a job there, pitch my English degree background, and Roger wasn't interested, so I went to Beagle Brothers, and Roger later lamented that he could have had MacroWorks, but it wasn't to be. But we were good friends with Roger, and in fact, if you go on the podcast, there's a panel discussion from '93 that's Roger, myself, Tom Weiser, and Alan Bird, and that's kind of fun. Roger's a hilarious guy to talk to and listen to, so definitely check that out if you haven't heard that before. Well, Roger Wagner, RW, is not the only Roger. There's another one here. This Dear Heather. Here's a photo of our dog, Roger. He doesn't really have hands, but I thought you might enjoy seeing his picture. I hope we'll be seeing you sometime soon. Your friend, Bert. Well, my daughter at that point was, 4 years old, and undoubtedly got a good laugh out of Roger Wagner. And that obviously came from none other than Bert, right? And who else would come up with something like that? And this is Bert at, I believe, Apple Fest 87, I think, is in San Francisco. May have been 88 in Boston, but can't remember when we got the new booth. It was right around then, but somewhere 87 or 88, Bert was there, and that same logo lives on today. I visited Bert about 2 years ago, and it's still hanging in his garage. And you see down here, he's got the giant train set, multi-level trains going above and below. Very intricate model trains, one of his big hobbies, along with bird watching and bird photography. Kind of stays out of the public eye as far as Apple II stuff and that. He's not really interested in doing interviews or things like that, but he does love birds and trains. However, he was willing to sign a Beagle Brothers chart for Mike, and so you see him signing that there, and see how we came full circle right back to Mike. So thanks for coming. Or do you want more? You want more? You want more? Okay, we can keep going. I do have more slides. So speaking of the Beagle logo, would anyone consider this plagiarism. Have you seen this before? Found this on the internet. They claim they didn't copy the Beagle logo. I wonder why they included a floppy disk on the bottom of their logo. Candy's coming in a floppy disk, and you know there are no similarities in terms of the gold trim around the green with the gold dots, and but no, they claim there was no copying involved. It was their artist created that from scratch.
Right. They covered up the notches. Saw it on TV and then they made it up.
Yeah, I guess. Candy bouquet. Well, I don't know anything else about candy bouquet except for that, but I thought it was pretty funny that it was that exact, and that they disclaimed to having any kind of influence from the Beagle logo at all, especially when they included the floppy disk. That was the best part. Yeah, it's even the dots, it's pretty crazy. But anyway, Bert and Sharon are in retirement in Fallbrook. Bert just recently had knee surgery, so there's a classic look from Bert. As you probably can't see from back there, but his eyes are bugging out when you see up close. He's a bit of a clown. But that was I think last year when he had the surgery, but he's doing well. So as I mentioned earlier, I have been in touch with some of the guys. In 2015, there's is Quinn here? Yes. Quinn might not recognize this picture. Well, you're probably in on the Zoom, but this was on the podcast when we had Alan Bird, top left, Tom Weiser, Mark Simonsen, and myself. And we did an episode on Open Apple, so you can listen to that online. Just talked to Tom. There was somebody in here, I can't remember who it was last night. They were asking about Pronodos, whether there'd ever been a protected version. And I checked with Tom today, and he said no. They did license it for an exorbitant fee of $250 if you wanted to license it for your product. I don't know how many they sold, but you look at some of the licensing nowadays. $250 let you unlimited copies of Pronodos on your own product, but they never did protect it. So the guy who said he cracked the protection either found someone else who did it, or he was trying to impress people by cracking an unprotected piece of software. I'm not sure which. But that later on, this was February. It was February of 2015 when we did this interview. And then a few months later in May, I went to San Diego and went to Alan's house, and so we had a good time with our wives, had lunch with them, and Alan dug out his big plastic crates and boxes of Beagle stuff that he said he hadn't opened in like 10 years, so we had some fun digging through his old archives and looking at some of his stuff. Alan Bird's initials are obviously AB, and you know we got to be connecting our slides, right? So the next great thing in San Diego was a Baja for AB. That would be this sandwich right here, Old Town Deli and Liquor. It's roast beef with chilies and Swiss cheese. Best thing around. Whenever I go back to San Diego, I like to have one. It was right next to the second Beagle office. So Bert's house was the first one, and then they got the office in Old Town, which is where we were when everything leading up to timeout came out till Bert and Sharon sold the company to Mark. Then we moved a little farther north. But during the initial glory days and all that, the office was in Old Town, and the liquor and deli was just down like half a block away. So we became regulars, not at the liquor side, but at the food deli side of things, and ate a lot of meals there when we were hashing out our different programs and showing them to each other. There's another guy that likes to stuff his face just as much as I do. Anyone know who that is? Yell it out if you know. Ever heard of Steve Disbrow? Publisher. Yeah, I guess he got a new wife there and got married in December, and that's Steven, and he was famous for publishing what? GS Plus. Yes, GS Plus magazine. Cool thing about GS Plus that I found as I was kind of getting ready for this and going through some old things, and I showed some guys this earlier today, but they had an article in 1993. It was called Bite the Bag at 1993 KansasFest, and it included this. As we left the show late Friday, I had to return early to attend my 10-year high school reunion. Joe and I couldn't help but wonder if this will be the last KansasFest. Subsequent conversations with Tom haven't told me for certain if this was the last KansasFest. Tom told me never to ask him that question the week after the show, but we certainly hope not. It'd be a shame if this were the last one. Well, obviously it was not the last one because here we are 24 years later. So here's Tom looking into the future, trying to figure out if it would indeed be the last KansasFest or not. And of course he's got his Resource Central shirt celebrating 15 years, and we all contact them on Genie nowadays. But A2 Central, yeah. But that was Tom back in the day when we were meeting over at Avila College in the 90s. Another slide here, I'll just briefly excerpt from that same article. They made a little typo that I thought was pretty funny at the top. After moping the blood off the floor, I think they meant mopping, but moping might be, if you lose and you're bleeding, you might be moping too. This is talking about the Bite the Bag episode, and it said that, this is Steve writing, believe it or not, this contest went on for hours, top right. I myself played for a little while, but I eventually gave up and turned the contest over to the more gifted contestants. In specific, Randy Brandt acquitted himself very well. He was heavily bet upon by Brian, Peter Zach. Zach would not play himself, no doubt due to some injury. Well, if you don't know Brian Peter Zach, and you probably don't, he's this dude here, a big guy. And the other big guy, making me look very small, is Jay Jennings. He was known as Mohawk Man. This year he'd already cleaned up, but a couple at KansasFest before that, he came in with a 12-inch blonde mohawk, so nobody missed them. You just see the crowd. You just see this mohawk floating above the crowd. But he had punkware software, and he did tools. He worked with the softest guys back before id Software started, so like John Romero, Lane Roth, all those guys that developed id in Shreveport. And Jay was part of that group. Now he's up in Alaska, and I went to see him in 2014. We had a great time hiking around. He did the iOS conversion for ioSilver for the 30th anniversary. I wrote a little bit of the code, but Jay definitely did the vast majority, like 90% of the work on that. And we were just in touch this weekend because he's doing the 64-bit one, so he stopped getting the annoying message about the slowing your machine down and incompatibility. So we'll get the 64-bit one out here shortly. But Jay does game design and works for municipality of Wasilla or something and close to Anchorage. So he's up there in beautiful Alaska. I showed Ken top 10 things to do at 93 KansasFest. I thought I'd share a couple of those real quick. Number 10, play Bite the Bag. I hear that's ending now. But number 9, try to drive while wearing official BiteWorks 3D glasses and 3D underwear. I have no idea what this 3D underwear thing is. I don't remember, but it sounds scary. There's a couple other things on there. Number 4, count the PowerBooks. I think we could hit 0 on that. Maybe if we counted MacBooks now, we'd have a higher number. Do yet another imitation of Beavis and Butthead. They spelled imitation wrong. Get rich selling 8mm videotapes to Roger Wagner. I guess there was a running joke on there with Roger. And then the final one was try not to stare at the heads of the bald guys while talking to them. I don't know what Steve was thinking there. He's joined that group, I think. But anyway, that's what it was like 24 years ago at KansasFest. Transitioning with the Beavis and Butthead theme, we had a little cartoon for the AppleWorks 5 ad campaign, never officially released, but it circulated around the company. Of course, with Dan Vercade down here, he was one of the authors with me. Q. Yes, Dan, yes. See Dan there? So he was in color on the box. But as it says up here, this sucks. Yeah, but Dan's hair rules. Well, Dan's hair still rules here 30 years later. He's still rocking the mullet, and you got to give the guy props. 2016, when this was taken, the guy still got the mullet going on. Business up front, party in the back. But his son Carl, who was a little kid when he was working at Beagle, Carl actually is such a good guitar player now. He made it to the finals back in a vocalist on The Voice. He was playing guitar for and made it to, I don't know, like the quarterfinals or something. He's a full-time worship pastor at a church in California, very good guitar player. Dan's more into keyboards, but picked up looks like a Fender there to jam a little bit with his son. So I stay in touch with Dan. The interesting thing about Dan is that he had a little legal experience you may have heard about with this male model who was doing, I don't know, successful business clothes or something. Anyone know who that is? Ever hear Quality Computers? Joe Gleason. So Joe published Time Out Grammar, and somebody claimed, which was written by Dan, and somebody claimed that the code had been stolen from another product, and they took him to court, and Dan had to fly out to like Ohio or somewhere and had to testify in court. And the good news is they ended up winning the case and proving that Dan had written the code and nothing was copied. But it was a little scary for Dan because he'd never, been taken to court before over a software issue. But he said it was very educational and that it was more about the lawyers than whatever the truth was. But at least he knew he'd written the code. He hadn't copied it anywhere. But they had that. So Joe was kind of a crazy guy. He was a lot of fun. We went to Apple Fest 88. No, 88 was Boston. 87 in San Francisco. And so one night he gathered up a bunch of the Beagle guys. I don't know if there's anyone else. There was mostly Beagle guys. And he rented a limo, and we went hitting video game places. So we'd pull up in the limo, bail out, play video games at an arcade, and then pile back in the limo and go to the next one. So that was a lot of fun. That was Joe. Well, how did that all end up driving around in a limo with Joe Gleason? Well, it started when I was looking for work. I'd been working with Dan Vercade at a startup FM radio company, and things were kind of going crazy there, so I quit. Dan was still there for a while, but I quit and I was looking for work, and as I mentioned before, I contacted Roger Wagner. He wasn't interested, so I wanted to contact Beagle Brothers, and my wife addressed an envelope, and she put down Siera Vista. Well, obviously there's 2 R's in Sierra, but we were broke enough, we were down to our last envelope, and she's like, oh no, I don't have another envelope, and I spelled it wrong. I said, just stick an R in there, they're not going to read it anyway, and even if they do, they're not going to get back to us. So, we were that was our last stamp too, I think. So she mailed it off, and of course, we got a call back from Sharon, I don't know, 3 days later, whatever mail took back then. And she said, Bert's interested, but he doesn't talk to people. I'm like, okay. She said, Bert will send you an assignment, and you write some sample documentation, and if he likes it, then he'll interview you, because he doesn't want to really talk to people unless he's probably going to hire them. So they sent me information about Extra K and Pro-Byter. Those were the 2 new Beagle products being created. Of course, ProDOS was just coming out. And so I wrote, not only did I write some docs for Extra K for one of the apps, I also wrote a little app. And Mark had was called Extra Apple, I think, and it would create 2 64K Apple IIe's simultaneously in your 128, so you could just hit one hotkey, like a control something, and it would switch. So you could like have BASIC running in one and have a totally different program in the other, and it would just swap the memory banks. So you obviously had to be programs that just use 64K. But I wrote a little program to make it easy to copy, so you could write a DOS program in one segment of it, copy it over, and then hit a key and it would copy your AppleSoft program back into a ProDOS partition. All you had to do was save it. So if it was a plain basic program, it used to be kind of complex to convert that, and now it's just a matter of you just run the DOS one, hit the key, hit run my program, and save it in ProDOS, and you had your conversion done. So anyway, I sent that back to Bert, and I guess he was impressed because I got a call from Sharon saying, okay, Bert's ready to talk to you. Here's the address. Come to the house. That was at 4315 Siera Vista in San Diego. And I drove down at the appointed time. I walked up, saw the doorbell. It said, press once for trapdoor, twice for doorbell. Look down, you're standing on what looks like a trapdoor, little wooden frames. And then I looked up, and in the window, there's just this hand reaching above, just kind of doing this, maybe a little hint of blood on the side. It wasn't Halloween either, but okay, I've definitely come to the right place in the sense of this must be Bert's place. So I rang the doorbell twice really quick, and trapdoor didn't open. And Sharon let me in, and there was a table with like elephant feet. I think they're actual, like it's probably back before illegal or whatever, but they're actual like elephant feet for the legs on the table. And went up the stairs, and of course Sophie the Beagle was there, and looked up on the wall, and there's 3 clocks, and they different time zones, and they were labeled San Diego, LA, Seattle, or San Francisco and Seattle. Of course, all set at the same time. That was Bert. Always a humorous guy. But anyway, he had a big $30,000 typesetting machine. I mean, it stood like almost as tall as this. He was sitting at that, and he was working on one of the manuals. And, obviously, to get this quality, you weren't going to get that printing it on an Apple II with a dot matrix. So he had this huge typesetting machine that he was laying out manuals on. But we talked. He made me an offer, and it was more than minimum wage. I would have taken minimum wage just to get a job, especially with Beagle. And got to work on that stuff, and away we went. So then in '85, I wrote Big U, which is that one down there, and that was one that Bert had started, and I was hoping maybe I'd get my name on it along with him, by Bert Kersey and Randy Brandt. But by the time it came out, I'd written most of it, so he just put my name on it, and that was my first product. And then '86, we did MacroWorks. Merlin had, anyone use Merlin Pro? And so, it's got macros. You can hit the Option key or solid Apple key, and it could do macros. I was fascinated by that, and so once I knew where AppleWorks was gathering keystrokes, I figured I could take that concept and make it work there, and we did, and it did very well. And that was my first royalty product for Beagle. Interestingly enough, in 1986 was also when Stryper came out with their To Hell with the Devil album, the metal band from back then, and we just saw them on tour on the 30th anniversary tour. Got to hang out backstage with Michael Sweet, the lead singer, Robert Sweet, the drummer. My wife is not a rocker. She's not into metal, but, get to hang out backstage with a band. I guess you do it anyway. But she's the Sweet brothers, very sweet. Bad transition, but Liz was the very sweet receptionist at Beagle Brothers. So most people don't know anything about Liz, but she worked there for a lot of years and kind of kept things going in the office. And one day she came in. She wasn't gullible. She was young. Yeah, she was young. So she comes in one day, and there's a gauge on her monitor. There's actually an air pressure gauge that Bert had attached the night before. And she's looking at it, goes like, what's this thing on my monitor with these numbers? And Bert says, oh, that's to monitor your words per minute. It's like, okay, am I not typing fast enough? Of course, she realized that no matter how fast she typed, the needle just stayed all the way down. It would have been cool if Bert could have rigged it up to actually control the needle too, but that's the kind of stuff Bert was always doing. Liz also had a couple interesting things that I enjoyed. That I told you about the Old Town Deli and Liquor. So we're walking down there it was just down the hill from Beagle, and we're walking down to get lunch one day. There's me and Liz and Mark and probably a couple other guys. And she's not very dark-skinned, but she's Hispanic. And some guys were coming up the road, and they start making some comments about her. She's like 19 at the time, and they make a couple of comments in Spanish, not realizing that she's a native Spanish speaker. So as they're saying a couple things, they're walking by, she just whirled around and let them have it in the fastest Spanish I've ever heard. But they were turning red and backing off. And then we went down there like, Liz, what'd you tell them? She goes, well, I just started telling them, like, wait till, if your wife finds out or your mother finds out. And, she just let them have it with both barrels. It was pretty hilarious. But one final thing about Liz, we were sitting in the office one day between builds of software or something. And I asked her a trivia question that I'll ask you, and that is, Michael Nesmith, he's the Monkees for the older folks here. He was in the Monkees. He actually had the Monkees was his second greatest revenue source. Where did his primary wealth come from? Whiteout. His mom invented Whiteout. So I told Liz that, and the crazy thing is, like a week later, I walk into the office. She goes, I can't believe it. And I said, what? She goes, they had a call-in on the FM radio station. They said, how did Michael Nesmith make the bulk of his fortune? And I called in, and I won tickets to a concert. Tell me more trivia. It's probably for Wham or something. She was a big fan of them, as I recall. Well, Liz was in the office. Then there was someone who came in part-time with a similar name, and that was Lisa. Not any relation to Steve Jobs' Lisa. This is the niece. Can't see much over there, but that's Bert and Sharon's niece, Lisa. And she would come into the office again, another one of the workers there that helped out, did a great job. And anyone know who this is? No guesses? You heard him speak earlier. That's Mark Simonsen. So that's at my house. We bought a house up in Ramona, San Diego, not too far from San Diego County, not too far from San Diego City. After some of the macro royalties started coming in, we moved up there, and so this is like our open house thing. We had all the Beagle people up. But my brilliant transition here is that Mark is a huge Beatles fan. He plays guitar. He's in at Brigham Young University football games before the game starts. At the tailgate parties, his band does a lot of the music for the barbecues and stuff there, and he's a guitarist. But he's a huge Beatles fan. So, of course, when we went to London in 2015, had to do the Abbey Road thing. For those of you who are too young to know, Abbey Road is the studios where Beatles recorded. It's right down behind that fence is where Abbey Road Studios is, and the original album looked like that, so you can see the Beatles crossing the road there. Paul happens to be barefoot. People made a big deal about that. Some said maybe it meant he was really dead, and they put in a double for him and all this kind of stuff. But in any case, it was fun to walk across Abbey Road when we were in London. But they're not the only celebrities with a link to Beagle. Jack Cassidy, father of David Cassidy. No, different Jack Cassidy. Anyone remember the Partridge Family? Yeah, David Cassidy. So this Jack Cassidy is known to dance the jitterbug at his niece's wedding in Tel Aviv here a few months ago, rocking the long hair and the cool hat. That's the Jack Cassidy that helped write Alpha Plot and Das Boss, and also the only Beagle product that was not for Apple. Anyone know what that platform was? Somebody here said they had it, yeah.
Beagle right for the Macintosh?
Well, I mean, Mac is an Apple company
I'm
product.
sorry,
I didn't say Apple II, but non-Apple related.
IBM PC mini picks.
No, company.
Well, it was MS-DOS, and Minipix was targeting. Yeah, I guess that one came out later for it, but it was just graphics.
Right.
He actually wrote a utility program for MS-DOS, and I don't know if Windows 3.1 was even out yet. It was probably prior to that, so I think it was just MS-DOS. And the sales were so bad that was the end of Beagle trying to crack into that market. It had no name recognition there, right? I mean, it was just a totally unknown market, and they tried it. They took some ads out, and just sales were pretty much zero. I mean, I don't even know if it sold 1,000 copies in its lifetime. I think it was probably measured in dozens or maybe a few hundred. Not because it was a bad product, just because Beagle had no name recognition in that world. So that's Jack, but he was one of the original guys that was friends with Bert, and like I said, Alpha Plot's very early on, and Das Boss, that's very early in the Beagle history. So that is Jack Cassidy. Another guy that had some connections to Beagle, Mark Munz. He was in high school or college. I think he was at a community college when he contacted me, and he's with his sisters there, the Munz family. But Mark wrote some stuff for me for Gem Software, late night patches, making patches to AppleWorks, and we just got that name because we were watching a lot of Letterman back then, and so we just called it late night patches. And then my son ended up being on Letterman, but that's another story. Mark got a job at Beagle right out of college, came down, and he played a major role in he did some of the timeout stuff, but he also was heavily involved when they made that switch to the Mac and worked on that. And then he got a job with Intuit and Quicken and got stock options. And next thing I knew, he was living in Hawaii trying to decide what he wanted to do next. So I guess it worked out well for him. But he now has unmarked software, and he's got some tools for like scrubbing files and things of that nature, so that you download stuff from the internet and clean up all the weird formatting stuff like that. But check out unmarked software. That's Mark Munz. And also wrote Deja 2, which I published through Gem Software, which allowed you to run AppleWorks on the Mac. It wasn't an emulator in the sense of Sweet 16, because it was just one Mac product, and then it tapped into the memory and printing and all that kind of stuff. So it essentially allowed you to take advantage of a lot of the Mac features, including calling AppleScript commands and stuff from right inside of AppleWorks. And in fact, that one the demonstration of controlling the 120 volt stuff was great. I was thinking with Ultra Macros, because we have peaks and pokes in there, we could probably even set up some macros and use AppleWorks and have scripts in there and things that would control 120 volt stuff. Would be kind of fun. Wouldn't even need to use AppleSoft. All right, so there's another there's Mark Munz. Another M name was Matt Reimer. I couldn't find a current photo of him, so that's him right here. He's the middle kid. He's now like 40-something, so I guess it's an old photo, but you'd never guess from the photo itself that it was old. His mom's hair and glasses have changed since then. Crazy story about Matt, a couple of them. So I was substitute teaching a class and killing time. I gave the kids homework, and I'm writing down some AppleSoft stuff. I was figuring out some routine, and he came up for something else, and he said, "Oh, you into programming?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, me too," and he's just like, I don't know, 17-year-old kid. We start talking, we hit it off, and next thing you know, I got him a job at Beagle Brothers, and I'm working with him, and he's famous for Platinum Paint. How many of you have seen Platinum Paint? Yeah, quite a few of you. So Matt created that. I did one contribution to platinum paint. Matt calls me up one day. He goes, I'm having trouble figuring out smoothing. He goes, I can't remember the name of the other big paint program that was out there at the time for GS. Deluxe paint. And it had a really bad design flaw where sometimes when you did the smoothing thing, there'd be colors like green and blue, and all of a sudden it would pick red for the smoothing color. It'd be these blotches in the middle. It was really ugly. So it didn't do very good color averaging. And he said, I'm trying to figure out a way that when you tell it to blend between two colors, no matter what they are, that it makes sense and you don't end up with weird red blotches like that one. And so I'm trying to help him, and so I'm thinking, okay, you got red, green, blue, color space, so I've only got two hands, so my tip of my nose, it could be like red, green, blue, and now you want to average them. Like if you look from this angle, they're pretty close here, but if you look from here, they're pretty far apart, so how do you figure out? So I'm sitting in my office doing this, and my wife walks in. What are you doing? I said, I'm working on a software problem. She's like, hey, you got other problems. But I told Matt what you do is you average the difference between every color and then put that together, because you've got to get all the angles. These two look really close when you look straight on, but when you rotate, they're far apart. These might be closer here, but you look here and they're far, so you've got to compensate for all three of them, average that, and he did, and it worked great, and he built a little table, and color smoothing didn't have any ugly red blotches, so it was good. But I go over to his house one day, and his grandfather's there. And we start talking, and where are you from, and all this stuff. Well, he's from Canada. Well, I'm originally from Canada. And where are you from? I said, Manitoba. And he goes, oh, yeah. I said, I was born in Morris, Manitoba, south of Winnipeg. And he goes, oh, what was your grandfather's name? I said, Henry H. Brandt. And he goes, he was my good buddy in the 1930s. We worked at the same company, ate lunch together. So 50 years later, 2,000 miles away from Manitoba down to San Diego, I find out that a half century earlier, my grandfather had been buddies with Matt Reimer's grandfather. And Matt and I had been good friends for like 5 years before we found out that half a century earlier our grandfathers had been buddies. So it's weird, yeah, small world. So that was really cool, actually. My grandfather died in '72, so he didn't get to find out about that. But it was really cool to talk to somebody that had been his buddy, and back before my dad was born, back when my grandfather's teenage years. So anyway, that's Matt Reimer. He's living in Arizona now. Still a programmer, doing a lot of stuff out there, and great guy. He's got like 3 or 4 kids. Another guy that was involved with Beagle was Lester Simpson. Anyone know what Lester wrote? Any Beagle historian, or actually Gem software historian, AppleWorks historian? He had a little program called Flexical that was a calendar driven using macros in the AppleWorks spreadsheet. And he was an athletic director, a great basketball coach. I think he still has the record in California for most consecutive wins home. He went through a stretch where they didn't lose a game at home for like 6 years. So he, I believe, still holds the record for consecutive home wins in boys basketball in California. But he became athletic director also, and so he wanted to keep track of schedules, and he set up a bunch of macros to automate that using AppleWorks. And so I said, other guys could use this. Let's make a product out of it. So we came up with Flexical, and he came up with me to AppleFest in Boston, and sure enough, we actually sold some, and nobody got rich, but he made a few $100 off it and had the fun of having a product with his name on it. But the interesting thing was I was teaching high school with him first year out of college, and I talked about wanting to start a computer company and the whole Gem software thing where I'd done the grade aid. And he wanted me to make an official company and kind of invest in it, so he said he'd pay for the state of California fees. And so we registered the name Gem Software, and we did the business cards. I gave one to Brian and one to you, Javier. And those were from back in 1984. And 1984. And so I made a little deal with him that I'd give him some, kickback on stuff that I sold and that. And so he ended up, of course, getting all the timeout products free and all the Gem software products free. And then he ended up having his own product. So he said it was the best investment he made. And I took him to AppleFest a couple of times. And so we went back. He's teaching high school now. And that's the funny thing is he was the jock. He was the coach and PE guy. But he got into computers because of AppleWorks. And notice where we are. Butch IMAX. He now teaches computers at a private school and has this big computer lab with like 20 iMacs, and it all started with him being interested in AppleWorks. And I rescued him because when I got to know him, he goes, "Oh, I bought a computer." I said, "What do you got?" And he goes, I've got a Commodore 64. And I said, "Well, that's nice, but let's go." I'm sorry. I blew that one. He said, "I've got a TI." He had a TI computer. What was it, 99A or something? 4A, yeah. And so he had one of those, and it was really giving him trouble. Like, he'd had it for a week, and he was having trouble. I said, "Take it back." And I said, "The Apple IIs are kind of expensive. They had one at school. I'd rather have you do that. But you can afford a Commodore 64, so let's go that route." And he actually learned basic programming on the Commodore 64, and he loved playing the Stratomatic football. Anyone remember that board game where you have cards and stuff, and you play football or baseball? They had a few different sport games. And he actually created his first program was to allow him to track his progress playing Stratomatic and just kind of automate some of that. And then we got him into programming. He bought a 2C+, so he ended up finally getting an Apple II. And then that's when he got into AppleWorks and Flexical and all that stuff. So still a great, lifelong friend, and we had a good time. He actually had me speak to his class, and we demonstrated the new IO Silver app there. So the kids almost always, you can't take your phone out. But this time he said, "Okay, everybody, you get to take your phone out in class today, but you have to download Randy's game." So, so they downloaded the game, and away we went. All right, so another one here. This is an unusual photo, but Dimitri Geystor, I couldn't find a picture of him, but he takes these macro photos of insects. And so there's a whole bunch of them. If you just Google his name, you'll find all kinds of insect photos, close-up things that Dimitri does. But he's from France, and I don't know if he's still around. I haven't heard from him a few years. He was an interpreter at the UN, and he'd retired, so he's getting up there in age, so he may have passed on, because I haven't seen anything from him like in the last 5 years. But he would send like birthday gifts to my kids, like little books from France or whatever. And he was known for one huge thing, and that was translating products from English to French. So my Pathfinder gem software product, anyone ever see Pathfinder? Anyone, two? Pathfinder was a way to, on the early AppleWorks, you had to type in the full path name when you wanted to set a Protoss path name. And so what Pathfinder did was it would scan the drives and give you the names, and you could just pick them and step through them, and it would set them, kind of like a modern system for picking paths when you go through and click on a subdirectory and it adds it to the name. And so I got that idea one day, and that 24 hours I had it written. So it was my quickest product ever, and I sold it for $20. I showed it to Bert and Sharon, like, it's too small, sell it yourself. So I sold it for $20 and sold like 1,000 of them and made $20,000 for one day's work. It was a good deal. Wish I could do that more often. However, if all you do is 20,000 over the course of several years, you can't really live on that. And I did not have any other ideas that allowed me to create products in one day and sell for 20 grand. But that was one great one. Well, Dimitri translated that into French, and I made a deal with him that as long as he did the distribution and everything in France, he'd just pay me like, I don't know, $5 a unit royalty. And so basically we called it our pizza money. Every month or two I'd get a check from France for, 20, 30, $50. I don't think it ever topped 100. But it was still some extra pizza money, and allowed the French users to have translated works. And he did other products as well. So there's a magazine called Palm, which is French for Apple, and he contributed to that and was involved in that. But he's not the only Frenchman that had Apple II connections. There was some stalker. I went out there in 2016 last year, and some guy showed up at our hotel. Oh no, that's how we got to our hotel. That's right. He showed up at the train station, and Antoine gave us a ride. This is my brother-in-law Dave, and of course me, Antoine, my buddy Roger, and Don, a couple guys I knew from college. So we went on the Bandit Tours trip last year. But our connection to get from the train station in Paris and cruise around Paris that night and then get to the hotel was none other than Antoine. The year before, he kidnapped me and dragged me to his backyard and forced me to have a barbecue with him. So I took the photo there, and that's my best friend from high school, John, who's a VP at a tech company, manages teams in like 6 cities. So he's a computer guy, his wife, and my wife, Joanna. So we had a great time with Antoine and his wife, Emmanuel, and my wife plans to return next year to see them. But not to hurt any feelings, Antoine, but she's even more excited about this guy because Olivier has twins, just like we do, and she's already made some clothes, and I took them every time I was getting ready to head out the house from the trip last year. She's like, make sure you give the clothes to Antoine and tell him he's got to give them to Olivier. And then she wasn't happy until we got a photo of them wearing them. That, yes, his twins got the clothes she made. This is obviously the Eiffel Tower here. But she's very eager to meet the twins in person, so she won't be happy until she meets the twins. Her twins, our twins, are 23, as you saw, and married, so she wants to see some cute little twins again. But going back in time, I guess, right, to when we were young, when thought I was Tom Selleck, you know, rocking the mustache. So this was this is a still from a video taken at Apple Fest. It says Beagle Brothers down there. It's not the greatest quality, but a Canadian group did a satellite feed from Apple Fest. So they interviewed me there because I was Canadian. They liked that. And they fed the thing by satellite back to user groups all across Canada. A report from Apple Fest 1980, is either 87 or 89. I can't remember which one. I think it was probably 89, which was one of the last ones. But that was a fun time. We had big mustaches, and we had hair that wasn't as gray. Another guy that had hair that wasn't as gray is this guy here, and that's Ross Lambert. Anyone here of 816 magazine, Ariel Publishing, know your Apple II history? He was a pretty major publisher, notch below people like Insider and A+, but his was more aimed at programmers, so he had a lot of programming routines. It's kind of more like a Nibble type magazine, but it was pretty popular. And this is Ross in San Francisco a year or two ago at the famous Lori's Diner with the old style gas pumps and that. But the funny thing about Ross is, there's a couple funny things about Ross. Number one, I got to know him in '87 at Apple Fest, and we became good friends right away, and I told my wife about him, and we were driving up. He lived in Washington. Well, her folks are in Washington. I said, let's stop by. Then first we ended up having a little developer conference in Seattle, in Washington, where we got Jay that I mentioned earlier and another guy named Mars Saxman and me. We got a contract with Apple to do a basic for Apple. And so we started designing this object-oriented basic that was really cool for the Mac. And we got funded for the first 6 months, and then Apple had all their cuts, and that all got trashed, and then Real Basic ended up filling the niche. But at one point we were contracted to make a basic, and we were trying to bring in some Apple II concepts and all that. But my wife said, I know Ross. I said, no, I met him at Apple Fest. There's no way you could know him. I mean, you weren't even at that Apple Fest. She goes, no, I know him. And we go to their house, and they're sitting there talking, and they start bouncing things off. Well, all of a sudden the light went on. In 76, Ross was in high school. My wife was like in middle school. And he came to their town, and they had a little week club there where at their church or something. Ross was playing guitar, and he was friends with my wife's older sister, who was more his age. But my wife remembered him, and he's like, yeah, we were in that town that week. And so it turned out my wife really had met Ross like 20 years before I did, which was really bizarre. But we created a product together called Online Army Knife for the Mac. It won a Mac User or Mac Week Editor's Choice Award. I'd have to go back and see, but it won some kind of Editor's Award, which didn't make any difference in terms of, it made me about $20,000 after a year of programming. And remember Pathfinder, $20,000 one day, 1 year. Pathfinder was a better deal than Online Army Knife for my career. But it was a cool product. It was a lot of fun. They didn't have built-in spell checkers in the Mac then, so it was kind of this thing we're jumping on. I had a lot of fun doing the suggested spellings, and I do user group demos and show how bad Microsoft Word was at figuring out a misspelling, and then how mine would come up with a better option. And I'd get lots of claps, but not very many sales apparently. But so we had a manual for that, and Ross has got it stuck on a shelf. And his daughter gets married and has like 2-3 kids with this guy named Chris, and he's a programmer. So he's over at Ross's house one day a couple years ago, and he's just kind of looking at Ross's computer books, and there's an Online Army Knife manual. He pulls it out and goes, whoa, you wrote this? And Ross goes, yeah, it says Randy Brandt and Ross Lambert on the cover. He goes, you did a user group, like 15 years ago at such and such a spot. He goes, I was a kid in the audience who was so blown away by the demo that I decided to become a programmer. 15 years later, he's the father of Ross's grandkids, So online Army knife didn't pay off as big for me, but for Ross it helped feed his kids, because as this kid became a programmer and now makes a living feeding Ross's grandkids with his programming skills. But it gets funnier than that. So Ross gets a job, I can't remember where he was, at the PUD, which is the Public Utilities. But Chris leaves his job and recommends Ross, so Ross comes in and fills that job. Then about 2 years later, Ross decides to leave for another option. He calls me up and says, hey, you want to fill my job? So I followed him. So his son-in-law left. He filled the job. Then I came in, filled the job. And then about 2 years later, I was looking for another job. I was getting a little tired of writing. It was C#, and I didn't want to write C#. Not so much C#. It's a cool language, but .NET, man, you got to be Microsoft. I didn't want to do that. If they would have been C# in some other environment, I probably would have been fine. But I just was tired of working with Microsoft stuff. So a buddy of mine had a job possibility. Well, John, the same guy I mentioned that I was in France with, he said, send me your resume. So I polished up my resume, left on some Apple Work stuff, Beagle stuff from back in the day. And I thought I should get it proofed. Well, Ross, like me, is an English major, so he's good at proofreading because he knows computers and he knows the English language. So I sent him the resume, and a couple days later he calls me back and says, resume's fine, but don't send it in. I said, well, why not? He goes, because I want to use it. I'm just starting a new job, and I'm going to be heading up a development team, and I want to hire you. So don't go work with the other friend. Work with me instead. I'll pay you more. So it's like, okay. So sure enough, that's what happened. Ross got me a job at the new company he was at, and I started there in March of 2014. And we worked together on a bunch of stuff, and he eventually left to go back to work with his son-in-law. He turned him down 3 times, but they kept raising the salary every time, and he's like, okay, I'll work with my son-in-law for a bunch more money. But he's having to work with some Microsoft, and he said it's not that much fun, but it pays well. But as for me, I'm still at the company. So in March, they flew me out to the office in New Jersey, right on the river there, looking over to the Freedom Center, and the new where the Trade Center was, Freedom Tower, I guess it's called. The funny thing was, that was my first trip to the office. I worked there 3 years before I ever saw who I worked for. never been to the office until 2017. But so that's Ross. Played a big role in my life in many ways, and also did a lot of stuff with 816 and other publications that he had for both the Mac and Apple II. But he was one of the early Apple II publishers that did not get as much publicity as he should have, because he had good products and good magazines, but it just never quite took off all the way. But you should know him as part of history. I'll mention one other guy that's a buddy of mine. So Ross, I knew him since 87, so 30 years. So this guy, wrong way, there we go. This guy, Bryan Ross, I knew him since 1979. He was in high school at the time, and I was a freshman in college. And being from Canada, Thanksgiving, I had nowhere to go. So I was sitting in my dorm room, and the kid closed the kitchen. I'm thinking, great, it's Thanksgiving, and I'm not even going to get anything to eat. I don't know. I had a truck, but maybe I didn't have any money to go get something to eat. So anyway, I'm sitting in my room, and there's a knock on the door. And it was his dad, Marvin Ross, really good artist, worked at the school. And he just would go around every Thanksgiving pounding on doors looking for stray students and take them home to feed them, because he felt sorry for us kids that didn't have family in the area. I mean, talk about a nice guy. So he dragged me over to his house, and that's where I met his son, Brian, who was very rude and sarcastic. We got along great. So we became fast friends, and I got Brian into a little bit of computing. He became a teacher. He's a history teacher. He's been like teacher of the year, stuff like that. Also basketball coach. I don't know. He told me one year, he's like, I'm going to coach one more year basketball. I'm going to win coach of the year, and then I'm going to retire. I'm like, okay, that's good objective. Well, that year he was named East County San Diego coach of the year. And maybe he knew he had a good team that year. And he retired from that, and he's been focused on teaching. But he's been very cutting edge at using computers in his social study classes. But the one story I want to tell you that you've never heard before is the pain of developing software when you've got deadlines. We had, I don't remember which one, it was something related to macros. It was a timeout product, and we had a new release, and I don't know if it was for Apple Fest or if it was just a new release we had to get out, but I had to get the bug fixed and it was on a 2C. And I started on a 2C. That was my first Apple that I owned. I'd sold a K Pro I gotten from my father-in-law and sold that to get a 2C. But since then, I moved on to a GS, and I didn't have my 2C anymore. I just had a GS and a Mac. So the only way, and they couldn't reproduce this bug in the GS. It worked great on the GS. So I had to test it on a 2C. Well, the one complication was I was running a fever of 103. So I wasn't feeling very energetic, but I had to get in my car and drive about 25 minutes to Brian's house and set up his 2C and then try debugging software while I was trying to remain conscious. But got through it, found the bug, fixed it, and made it back home, and we got the software delivered on time. But sometimes you don't realize programmers have to suffer a little bit to get a product out there. And I know a lot of you program, but when you do the hobby stuff, it's not quite as much the same pressure as when you've got some publisher yelling at you, not in a mean way, just saying we have to get this done today. There are no other options. So yeah, driving around the hills of Ramona, winding roads with 103 fever probably wasn't the greatest thing, but I didn't pass out and we made it. So that's Brian. Then there's another guy in San Diego. See, I have these segues, right? There's always a connection. So the next guy is kind of crazy. I told some of you already. Well, I'm not saying he's crazy, although he looks like his hair's been bleached since I saw him last. But this was 5 years ago when Tony's given me the Apple II Forever Award there. But the funny thing is, I mentioned going back where I had the pictures with Bert and with Alan and all those guys when I'm back to California, and Brian. So Brian and I and his dad, the guy that started it all by inviting me out for Thanksgiving, and a couple other old friends, we go to a Padres baseball game. We get tickets in the center field where they had like a little restaurant area, like bar tables and stuff, so you could actually sit down while you're watching the game, not in seats, but on like bar stools. And a real casual area. You can walk around and go get drinks. Restrooms right there. So we're walking around enjoying the game, and there's Tony Diaz right there. I'm like, how'd this happen? So I took a picture with Tony. For some reason, I couldn't find it when I was throwing this slideshow together. But it was pretty cool that I'd seen Tony at KansasFest, and he was by far the most frequent attender. I don't know how many he's been to, but he's been to almost all of them since it began. But we ran into him at a baseball game, so that was kind of cool. And it's not, San Diego does have their problems. They don't have a very good team, but they still are thousands of fans, not dozens. So, I mean, the odds of finding somebody you know are still difficult. So I saw this ad I wanted to show you, and some of you may have seen it. But how to buy a personal computer. I just was too good not to throw that in there. And this has nothing to do with Tony or his hair or him being unusual. But there's the Apple II, keyboard there, monitor. Let me get this straight here. So you have the keyboard here, you set the monitor here. It doesn't seem like the most efficient way to play a game, or which is apparently what the kid's doing. It looks like he's got a game going. But I'm guessing maybe they staged that for the ad. It's just, it cracks me up that they're gonna, yeah. Obviously, they didn't know anything about using a personal computer, even if they thought they were going to tell you how to buy a personal computer. But in any case, I thought that was worth sharing. Because we started early and I talked fast, we've got time for a couple more slides. These are people that you may, if you don't know them, you may know about them. Anyone know what Dan Gukin is famous for? Dan was another guy from San Diego that hung around with us at Beagle parties and stuff like that, and online. Remember, we had BBSs back in the day. Bulletin boards, having discussions. Dan was an active part of that. He's now, I think he ran for office recently, but I can't remember if he won or not, in Idaho. But Dan was the guy who invented a concept that you all know of, even if you don't know who he is. He wrote the very first Dummies book. Windows for Dummies was Dan Gukin created that whole concept of dummies. Made some good money off of it, and then of course it exploded into a million books he had nothing to do with. But he's the guy who came up with the For Dummies idea. Christopher Van Buren was another guy in San Diego that hung out. He didn't really hang out with us per se, but we knew him and worked with him because he did AppleWorks templates and stuff. It was called QMAR Group. And he wasn't too far from the Beagle office, like 10 minutes away, and he published a lot of templates, spreadsheets, accounting things, little packages, things like that, and would kind of do some cross-marketing with us, but he wasn't really in our circle of coming to our parties or anything, but he was still a good guy in the San Diego area. And I have one of his products with me. I think I might have stuck it on the table up there. It was some kind of financial template. Anyone heard of this guy? Morgan Davis, MD Basic and other stuff. He also, some of you may not realize that he actually worked at Beagle for a while. It was kind of during the transition post timeout when the Mac stuff was getting going. He was working on some of the Mac related stuff and things like that. But he was a guy, I think he was actually having lunch with us with a day when we settled on the name Timeout. But he'd come over and hang out with the guys at Beagle. I think he was pretty good friends with Rob Renstrom. And so Morgan is still living in the San Diego area. And he was involved with a couple of companies that did pretty well. He's a really good guy. I used to play racquetball with him all the time. So I think he'd have probably beaten me more often if he was that buff back in those days. But he would have been a little more powerful on the serve. John Obrick, anyone know who John is? John was worked at Beagle in the sales department and then was a founder of West Code Software. So John and Rob Renstrom started West Code, and they sold Pointless, which was a font package for Apple II, which was, I think, written by Alan. Rob may have been part of that. Alan definitely wrote Inwords, which was word OCR, optical character recognition for Apple II. And then they did a Mac product called OneClick, and also written by Alan. So the post kind of Beagle era, Alan had a lot of his stuff published by West Code, which was John and Rob Renstrom. And I still stay in a little bit of touch with John. Haven't seen him in person for 30 years, but see him on Facebook and whatever. And that's his son, just graduated from Marines boot camp or whatever. And this is that's John and his wife. So another great guy from the Beagle days. And then I figured you guys need a little bit of humor, so I will humble myself and go back to 1976. Yes. So you got to like my big glasses and all that. But notice, this is my friend John that I showed you earlier that went with me to France that Antoine, Olivier met. We both have a little more hair there. But notice the ties and the shirts. Or not the ties, but the shirts. I forgot it was picture day. I showed up in a t-shirt, so I'm like, John, I got to borrow your shirt. So our senior photos are matching shirts because I wore his shirt and then gave it to him and he got his picture taken. So that's a true friend. But John's been one of my best friends since we met in 1973. Summer of 73, his family moved up from Colorado. And that had a big impact in several ways. One, because at Christmas time, his grandmother gave him a World War II game from Avalon Hill called Blitzkrieg. Anyone ever hear Blitzkrieg or familiar with some of the hex-based board games? So John got Blitzkrieg, and he calls me, and we weren't friends at all. We moved in different circles. But yeah, I get a phone call, and he's like, hey, this is John. I said, hey, what's up? And he goes, hey, I got this game. You want to come over and try learning it? So I went over and we became addicts and we played it at school, had clubs, and we were undefeated through high school and that in France, 1940. Never lost a game when we played as a pair because we were kind of obsessive. But I said, how come you called me? Because we weren't even friends. He goes, well, I didn't think any of my friends are smart enough to learn how to play it. So, like 300 pieces, But we became lifelong friends there. Well, then we were living in California, as you know, with Beagle Brothers. 1990, I was head of the, I was the area coordinator for San Diego for a ministry called Compassion International, sponsoring kids, some in the U.S., but mostly overseas underprivileged kids. You could do sponsorships for like, $20 a month or whatever to get them some food and education. So we had a volunteer network, and I was the area coordinator in San Diego, and we had a national conference in Colorado Springs. So we came up, and John was living in Denver area. And we kind of took a look at his house, and we looked at the price of house and went, now, why do we live in Southern California when I work at home? Like, we could get a house twice as big here and cut our house payment in half. And that's basically what we did. We got a much larger house for much less money, and we only had 2 girls, but next thing you know, we had 3 more, and so it was really good. We had a bigger house by the time there were 7 of us. But so John is the reason that I ended up moving to Denver. And he left and then came back. So he's back in the Denver area. And so we get to meet up at hockey games and whatever. We go watch some. He's got season tickets to the Avalanche. And we catch some games together and stay in touch. So there's John now. As you can see, he's a little bit older. This is at his son's wedding. But he's been a great friend and a fellow computer traveler. And the confession that we have to make, our first computer class was together. It was in high school. We had a 300 baud modem hooked up to a line printer and a card reader. We did not have a key punch. So we took our cards, we filled them in one letter at a time with pencil. We feed them in, we wait, we go get a drink, go to the classroom, come back to the lab. Hey, printout, something's coming in, syntax error. Oh my God. Fill out the card. Feed them in again, go do something else. Oh, bell rings, time for English class, you know. But John and I were not very good. It's too late. I think all the legal ramifications have long since expired, since this was in the early 70s. But the second semester class was unable to complete their projects because somehow the first semester class used up too much computer time. I have no idea how all that computer time could have been used up, but I did hear rumors that there were a couple of guys that were seen scrambling their control cards to see what happened, trying to get memory core dumps, and sometimes being caught going down the hallway with just like 20 pages of a printout, you know, walking down the hall with all this lined paper, and all of a sudden there comes a computer teacher and trying to ball it up, and all this, you know, one guy distracting the teacher while the other one tries to get rid of the evidence that we're getting all these massive dumps. So yeah, I do apologize to the students in the second semester who couldn't finish their stuff because some reason that computer time vanished. But education did prevail because here we are 40 years later, both full-time computer guys. So, I mean, at least something positive happened out of it, right? All right, so that's all I got on slides. We're right at 4:27. We got like 3 minutes. Anyone got any questions or in the back?
Have any comments to make about the Beagle Buddy program?
Chuck Newby was a great guy that lived in the area, was a big fan of the stuff, and he came up with the idea and came to us and said, hey, I got this idea for Beagle Buddies, and Mark said great, and he headed it up. Wonderful support team that allowed us to basically recruit some representatives and different user groups and then get them early product releases as an incentive and then be our support, because back then you couldn't just automatically upgrade an app like an iOS, you know, app store kind of thing. And so with the Beagle Buddies, we had a direct conduit to the user groups, and so I definitely give all props to Chuck, and if I had a picture of him, I'd put it up. But yeah, very good program. Anyone else? Oh, just adjusting glasses over here. Yeah, it's like an auction, you know. You touch your ear.
In the Beagle Brothers logo, the two guys, one of them kind of looks like Bert.
Purely coincidental.
Okay.
And does anyone know why there's no period after the Bros? Beagle Boys was the original, but Disney, the lawyer said, they hadn't actually sued yet, but Bert's lawyer said Disney will sue your pants off, and so there wasn't room for a period. He couldn't change Boys to Bros, and there was no room for a period, and then that was the legal name of the company without the period. So yes, that was an interesting bit of trivia there. And also the logo changed. It used to be Beagle Bros Micro Software. Microsoft freaked out. Microsoft, it says micro, yeah, but it's microcomputers and it's software. Everybody, you know, nobody's going to get confused. Well, so they finally settled on, the lawyers said, okay, we'll allow you to sell all your current product as with that, but you have to immediately change your logo, and anything new you print from now on can't say micro software. But at least we're able to sell the old product, so it didn't really cost us financially other than getting a new logo. And the new one was pretty cool until that candy place came along and ripped it off.
So what is the source of the artwork? Is it just
the source of which artwork?
Of the logo. I mean the
two old guys.
The two bros.
Bert just found it somewhere and put them together. It's kind of inspired by that Smith Brothers cotton candy or whatever. You know, he kind of liked that look. Well, if you've seen the old Beagle manuals and the ads, Beagle stuff was always known by that old style woodcut etching, you know, whatever, old illustrations, and so that was kind of a theme. Then Beagle got, quote, professional with the timeout stuff, and it was all more polished, so I tried to maintain the old Beagle look with the Gem software products, so like Total Control and those manuals. I still use some of those old line drawings and stuff like that for illustrations.
Did Bert actually design the overall logo?
Yeah, Bert designed that. Mm-hmm. Yes.
You all, your quality software.
Quality computers?
Quality computers. Did you all work up in Michigan as part of the same team? Or
no, we, Dan and I worked with Quality to create AppleWorks 4 and 5. And funny story about that was that we designed it. Of course, AppWorks 3, we did that under the auspices of Claris, and so they gave us Mac 2s. Well, we had to pay them back, but they gave us Mac 2s and they gave us MPW source code because we'd been using Merlin Pro up until then for all the timeout stuff. But all the AppWorks source code was in MPW, so we had to get set up with Macs. So they fronted us the Macs, and then we could pay it back out of the payments. And we all had Mac 2s, early color Macs, and of course, as we're adding these new features in for Claris, we're putting in little hooks for ourselves. It became much easier to add timeout and stuff like that because we put in more jump tables and we tweaked some of the code in there that didn't do anything for them, but it made it easy for us to patch it later. And so AppWorks 3 was really nice to add on to, a lot easier than the other ones to maintain. But so Quality Computers, we're over in Michigan, as you said. Joe Gleason, the male model I showed you. I got the idea for AppWorks 4, Q Bryan. AppWorks 4, we added a bunch of new features in, but Beagle was past that, and so the only option was to talk to Quality. So we started working on it, and the idea was we would just call it like Works 4.0 if we had to, because it'd be this giant patch disk. Patches were established, so there was no issue legally with patching AppleWorks. And so what I told them is we won't tell anybody, but basically, instead of patching, really what we'll do is you insert the original disk, we check to make sure it's an AppleWorks disk, then you insert ours and we'll just replace everything. And we'll have, basically we'll just create a new AppleWorks and pretend we're patching it, but it really won't be a patch, it'll be a replacement. But in the meantime, Joe is negotiating with Apple saying, look, we could both make money if we call it AppWorks 4, because we'll pay you a royalty for the name and we'll sell more, so we all win. And they're like, no one else can use the name. And so and Joe comes back and goes, Apple's not cooperating. They're not going to let us use the name. I said, look, tell them there's a history of patch disks. If they don't want to do it, we'll just call it Works 4.0 and they'll get 0. We're still going to sell it. Nothing's going to stop us. So if they want a piece of the pie, they need to give us the name. Otherwise, see ya, and we're still going to sell it. So they went back to Apple, and the lawyer's like, nothing or something. Okay, we'll make a licensing deal with you. And I think we sold more because it was called AppleWorks instead it was just Works 4, especially places like schools and stuff like that. They didn't want to patch this. They want AppleWorks 4. So Apple got their, Claris, through Claris, got their cut of the money, and we made more money doing AppleWorks 4. But we just flew into Michigan to shoot that video. Dan was working in California, and I was working in Colorado. And then we just sent stuff around. And then we did AppleWorks 5 and 5.1. So, yes.
That object-oriented basic for the Mac?
Yes.
Does any of that survive anywhere, or is it all gone?
No, because it never was completely finished. What happened was the guy that was our champion, so to speak, our product manager at Apple, got laid off in those massive cuts when Jobs came back and slashed half the people at the company because they were losing money. And so it just died on the vine. We had a contract that we hoped would get renewed, and it wasn't huge. I mean, it was like, maybe $30,000 per person for, a period of time. And they just said, no, that guy's gone. He wasn't there to fight for us. And then they just left it for like 6 months or a year. The company started bouncing back, and then Real Basic was already there. And so they just said, well, we'll make an arrangement with them. But it's a real bummer because it was a cool language and would have had a lot of really cool features and stuff. But we got paid for the work we did, but it just stopped halfway through. So, all right, I think we're done.
You need to wrap up.
Yep. Yeah.